Okay, next we have the idea of thetic consciousness, and this is a term that comes up a lot. Related to it is the idea of thematizing. That's another term that Merleau-Ponty loves to use, and that Merleau-Ponty scholars love to use. So we have thematic, thematized, thetic. All of these are different expressions of the same basic idea. Consciousness has multiple modes of acting, and one of those, represented again by Descartes and the cogito, is this kind of conceptual, explicit judgment consciousness. And this is exactly what Kant is talking about in transcendental idealism, in intellectualism. Merleau-Ponty refers to it as intellectualism, transcendental philosophy. Consciousness is what creates experience. It constitutes experience, and it does so through thetic consciousness. So the world is made sense of or explained by our consciousness using certain concepts, mediating our experience of sense perception or of the world through concepts, through reflection, and through language. So thetic consciousness is intellectual consciousness in a nutshell. And the big problem with thetic consciousness and with intellectualism is that it over-intellectualizes our experience. It takes experience to be primarily something intellectual, and it misses this whole world of lived body, lived experience, of all the things we talked about on the last slide: gesture, expression, all of this. And one of the best ways of characterizing that flaw in intellectualism is to focus in on the way in which it negates the possibility of there being a middle ground between presence and absence. And this is a really key notion for Merleau-Ponty, the idea of presence and absence. This is captured in a term by Husserl, which is appresentation. Appresentation. Instead of representation, we have appresented. And appresentation is the presence of an absence. So it is the way in which makes no sense, right? It's a paradox, but it actually makes a lot of sense. It's the way in which, I'm looking at a screen in front of me, and what is present is the screen. But what's appresented is the back of the screen, right? I see this screen as having a back, which I can't see right now, but which is on the horizon of my perception, right? On the horizon, something is on the horizon, it means it's far off. I can see that, if I went over there and got to the horizon, there's something that I could see there. On the horizon of my screen is the back side of my screen. So I'm presented with the front side of my screen, but the back of it is appresented. And so this is essential to consciousness for Merleau-Ponty. It's essential to perception. That anything that's present implies an absence. And this is really brought to the fore with the idea of figure background. Every figure, every presence is surrounded by and, outlined by a background. A thing, an object, a totality, treated as something wholly present. We're either present to it or it's absent. It's an on-off. There's no middle ground. There's no in-between there, right? I'm either thinking of something or I'm not. I'm either looking at something or I'm not. So that kind of thinking, that excluded middle, as it's called sometimes, there's either existence or there's non-existence. There's nothing in between those two possibilities. So this idea of presence and absence is based on a kind of naive view of psychological life, and it's committed to a paradigm of metaphysics or of ontology, often called presence to consciousness. So Merleau-Ponty is questioning this metaphysical paradigm of presence to consciousness. Here he's following Bergson and other philosophers as well. But basically, this is Descartes, this is Kant. We're going to come back to this idea of presence to consciousness a bunch. But in order to understand consciousness in a way that is not purely thetic consciousness, because thetic consciousness says, I'm thinking a concept, that concept is clear and distinct in my mind, I'm grasping that concept in present to my mind. If I understand that concept clearly and distinctly, I have better got all of its parts in the spotlight of my consciousness, and that thing, that object, that totality is fully present to my mind. So that's the paradigm we're breaking out of here with Merleau-Ponty, and he does that partially through reviving ideas from Bergson, but especially by Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologists had already questioned this dichotomy between presence and absence. They had already brought this idea of the background into primary importance. And the background is quasi-present, right? It's not fully absent. What's behind me, if you're looking at my face, is not absent. It's just not in the foreground. So there's a quasi-presence there, this kind of middle ground between presence and absence. It necessarily entails some degree of absence, like a horizon or like depth, right? Depth is a really tricky concept in Merleau-Ponty. We're going to come back to it a lot, but it's very rich, very important. Something that has depth means that it recedes into absence, but is not fully absence. It's receding into the background, but it's not fully non-being. Nor is it fully present. It's in that middle ground. And this connects to the idea of a milieu. Milieu is another term that Merleau-Ponty uses a lot and that has a very rich meaning for him. A milieu is the midst. It's synonymous with middle, with environment, with being in the midst. A milieu is a space, but it's also temporal. We shouldn't think of it as geometrical space, but of lived space. Being in a place that has meaning and that the distances between our body and other bodies have significance. That's a milieu. If you think of a milieu as like a classroom, it's a certain environment that has ways in which we are familiarized with that environment. We take up a milieu when we enter that space and interact with it in a meaningful way, in a way that's oriented, in a way that has relevance, right? There's the front of the classroom, and then there are the seats. The seats generally face the front of the classroom, or they're in a circle, whatever. All of those things are ways of ordering and organizing that space. A milieu is an ordered, organized space, basically. It's a way that we're already caught up in certain thoughts or concerns. So that's, again, this kind of temporal dimension of it. It's a way of living in a complex web of meaning and intentionalities, and a way of taking up a situation temporally. You walk into a classroom and you leave a classroom. There's a certain temporal relation that you have to that milieu. And one of the other really important aspects of milieu is it's not just multiplicity. It's not we can think of multiplicity as having multiple ways of being. So one would be disjunctive. I'm taking terms from Whitehead here, but a disjunctive multiplicity has no connection among the parts. The parts don't have any relation to each other. It's kind of an abstract notion to think of a disjunctive multiplicity. You think of this or that or that or that instead of this and that and that and that. The and is a conjunctive multiplicity. It connects the things, while a disjunctive separates the things and disjuncts them. So a milieu is a multiplicity in which there's a kind of global, holistic gestalt to it, right? There's a sense to it. And that doesn't mean that everything is, looked at in presence to consciousness as part of a single system in which everything has one meaning coming top down, in that kind of stratification and striation of the elements into a system. But it does mean that there's coordination among the parts, and that the multiplicity has some kind of, and the differences, and that has some kind of union in it. But this is an idea we're going to get at a lot more through a number of different avenues. As I said, milieu is a really important notion from Merleau-Ponty that comes up in a lot of contexts. The last thing I want to mention is that a milieu is something concrete. We are in a milieu, and it's historical, it's cultural, it's intersubjective. It has a public sense to it, right? Like a milieu is like the milieu of Paris in the 1940s when Merleau-Ponty was writing or something. So it has this sense of like the meaningfulness of a certain cultural context. And we can also think of a milieu in a natural context, that there's a certain meaning and order in space when we're in the natural world as well. Next, I want to talk about projects. This is another really important term for Merleau-Ponty, and I just want to disambiguate some things here because he uses the term both positively and negatively. Overall, it's a positive term for Merleau-Ponty. But, as we'll see, it's more complex than that. So a project is basically what it sounds like. A project, I'm going to do a project, I'm going to build a doghouse or something in my yard. I don't know. There's an endless number of projects that we could take up. It's a kind of commitment to a way of acting. We take up a certain project. It's a directedness of our effort. We undertake a project, right? And with that, there's a whole temporality. There's the anticipation of these future possibilities that are guiding our actions towards some goal. It's a very goal-oriented, teleological, purposive way of our consciousness engaging with the world. We engage with the world in projects. Okay? We anticipate certain consequences, and that's what makes sense of our orientation to the world in that project, right? Things are become graded in relevance. I'm borrowing a term from Whitehead there. Things appear more or less relevant based on our projects, right? So all of our perceptions end up being organized and oriented through our projects, at least to some degree. Not in a total sense, but to some degree. And therefore, our projects become a kind of impediment to doing phenomenology, right? Bergson talked about this with his idea of the attention to life. We give our attention to the world, we gear into the world, we enter into projects in the world, and that distracts us from doing phenomenology, from doing philosophy, from reflecting on our consciousness, right? I just moved into a new house, and in that process, you really have to like block out everything else. You just have to do the task at hand, right? Complete the project of moving. So projects deter us from being reflective on a deeper level, from entering into transformations of our consciousness, of doing phenomenology and things like that. And so this is really important for Merleau-Ponty because he wants to say that consciousness is never this completely disembodied, project-free, completely disinterested. So if there's an attention to life for Bergson, there's also an inattentiveness to life, which is when we like stop engaging with the world, stop trying to extract advantage out of the world, stop filtering our perception of the world through our expectations and anticipations and projects, in order to look at the world in a new way, in a kind of disinterested way, where more details can come to us and things like that. And that's very closely related to the phenomenological reduction. So in the phenomenological reduction, we table our projects. We set them to the side, be those projects our daily life or science and metaphysics and theory building and narrative construction and things like that. So we have to table our projects, and that can make it seem like consciousness maybe is something that doesn't have projects in the end, that it can be something totally disinterested. And this is basically what he means by a complete reduction. So Husserl attempted a complete reduction and basically just hits up against a wall again and again of the impossibility of a complete reduction. It's impossible to completely end all of our projects, disengage our consciousness entirely from its connection to the world. So Merleau-Ponty defines consciousness and the cogito and the ego and all of these kinds of terms as a project of the world. It's a project in and of the world. It's something that we take up and do and formulate and have certain anticipations of future possibilities and things like that. That is in and of the world. It is mixed in with language. It is embodied. It is an embodied intentionality. It's embedded within language. It involves gesture. Consciousness is inextricably in and of the world. And so that's what Merleau-Ponty means by saying that it is a project of the world. It's not something external and alien to the world that then comes to the world and confronts the world. So this really gets into the last thing I wanted to say, which is that consciousness for Merleau-Ponty is the primary concern. And he says in the very beginning of The Structure of Behavior, which is again his first major work, that his goal is to understand the relations of consciousness and nature. And consciousness, from Descartes to Kant, is something that is defined by judgment and intellect. Consciousness is sometimes clear and distinct. It knows things in a way that is reflectively verified and that is thematized, right? Certain aspects of consciousness become themes of our analysis, right? A theme is like a concept. It is when I say attention, right? Attention is a component of consciousness, conscious attention, right? I give my attention to something. It becomes present to my consciousness in my attention. So that becomes a thematized element of consciousness, right? In my daily life, in my lived consciousness, I am attentive to things without thematizing that attentive activity. When I give my attention to the very fact of being attentive, I thematize that attentiveness. I turn it into a concept. I give it a name in language. and I try and make it into a concept that is clear and distinct. But these kind of thematized moments of consciousness, thetic consciousness, clear and distinct ideas, concepts, all of that is actually a minority of our conscious life. The majority of our conscious life is lived and what he calls non-thetic consciousness. And now non-thetic consciousness is not non-being. This view that there's either presence to consciousness or nothing is totally wrong. And most of our consciousness is our way of dealing with the world and our body, our lived way of interacting with the world and other people in a way that's already meaningful. And we already have intentionality. We're engaging in gestures and behavior that have significance without ever rising up to a conceptual level. We don't have to interpret things in the world. So interpret here having a very consciousness as thematized, clear and distinct ideas. We don't have to look at something, recognize it as a certain object in a general concept, and then interpret that object as having meaning in our life through a kind of analogical or inferential way of reasoning. We just interact with objects that already have meaning and significance, that aren't even objects in a sense of a concept that needs to be recognized. We just already gear into them and take them up in our lived, embodied motor intentionality. So this sense of consciousness as already having meaning, and the way in which things already appear to us as meaningful, Merleau-Ponty, again borrowing certain ideas from Husserl, he says that things already constitute themselves in our experience. So Kant says consciousness constitutes the meaning of experience, and Husserl says things constitute themselves in our experience. So there's a major difference there. It's a subtle, way of saying things differently, but the difference is huge. On the one hand, our mind is putting everything together and making sense of the world, and it's basically subjective structures of experience that make the world make sense. Now, in this other way of thinking about it from Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, meaning and sense constitutes itself in our experience. It constitutes itself. We're not coming to it and just pressing certain structures on it and giving it a form. Its form comes to us and constitutes itself in our consciousness. And that type of meaning, the meaning that comes and constitutes itself in our experience, we actually have a great deal of difficulty reflecting on it, analyzing its components, and translating those meanings into thetic consciousness, into concepts, and into linguistic expressions. Body language is a really good example of this. Children and dogs are even capable of picking up and living the meaning of certain gestures and certain facial expressions and things like that. There's no need to think about them. There's no need to interpret them. We don't need to explicitly interact with them as a theme. We don't have to thetically determine them as having a meaning within a system and a definition, and all of that kind of logical conceptualization. Consciousness envelops all apprehensions of meaning and significance. Consciousness is not simply an intellectual act. It is much more expansive than that.